asked to give like my definition of rhetoric, and I think I put it in the notes somewhere, maybe. I would say that rhetoric is epistemological, ontological, and axiological. It is the way that we are metacognitive, and the way that we know what we know. It is the way that we understand who we are as we navigate the world, like coming into being, but also the ability to question our own being in the world. And then it's the way that we navigate culture and value, and we enact some culture and some values in certain situations, and different culture and different values in different situations as the need calls for, right? So that's a pretty common definition of contemporary rhetorical theory. A lot of rhetoricians hold this definition. Mine's not unique. Okay, so what does this have to do with, because now we're into section 11.2, or in chapter 11, section 2. And so the author, Conley, starts getting into stasis theory, but in a slightly different version, because we're into Roman rhetoric now. And Rome is a long time period, and there's a lot going on historically that's not covered here. You know, a lot of it we're just assuming, you know, we kind of remember. So when we get to stasis theory, and this is on page 150, Conley says that in tandem with the rest of rhetorical education, which guided the student's management of his face, posture, and gestures, stasis theory embedded the student in elite Roman and later Greco-Roman society. Its memory, mental habits, and perhaps most importantly, its claim to govern and pass judgment on rational, reasonable grounds. And then it goes on a deeper level, stasis theory represents and enables a rationalizing assessment of action in the world. It projects the order of language onto the surface of social configurations, and it makes possible the objectification of the relationship between the spoken word and popular belief. What we're really seeing here, and we're talking like Roman, and then obviously, as she points out, Greco-Roman times, is that rhetoric is situational. And it's not that rhetoric is situational, it's the arguments that are available are contextual and situational, and in paying attention to those contexts and those situations, culture is something that people are starting to pay attention to. Romans specifically are starting to pay attention to serve their own needs to an extent too, right? Like Roman rhetoric kind of develops, and then when the Romans conquer the Greeks, and then they start to adapt, while also saying they're not adapting because, you know, they need to make it their own, these Greek rhetorical ideas, they're also at the same time realizing that the most effective way to govern and to continue to conquer and to stay as large as they are while making that manageable is to have a shared cultural understanding and a shared cultural belief. And so what, especially here on 150, stasis theory is getting them and doing for them, and then rhetorically, like how it's operating in the world, is towards shared culture, that making arguments and making very specific beliefs is a form of shared culture. Okay, so let's put this in terms that we would understand. If I asked you to define the American dream, so let's take a minute and say, if you were just told to define the American dream, how does the average American define the American dream? Connected to that, how are we supposed to define and understand the American dream? So for most people, it's, you know, married family, so husband and wife in that specific arrangement, 2.5 kids, a house with a white picket fence, and most likely a dog, right? Like that's the American dream. But underlying all of that is this belief in social mobility, that people who are born into nothing can pick themselves up by their bootstraps and move into another class. And this is from the poorest all the way to the richest. We have this idea of social mobility attached to this idea of the American dream, and connected to all of that, like as a shared culture, especially because the continental United States is a ridiculously large landmass. It's important to share some values with that particular idea, and that particular idea is not just about a shared value. Like as soon as I went from here's the definition of it to it's connected to social mobility, it's connected to public education, it's connected to how we see voting rights, it's connected to a lot of arguments and logic and like all of the things that we break apart and are connecting, especially in here, to the idea of rhetoric. It's related to governance. When we hear politicians talk about like, here are the pieces of my platform, you know, we're not going to pick sides here. We're just all politicians have platforms, and their platforms usually have a version of the American dream that aligns with their belief system and the beliefs of their constituents. The higher the office, as in the more federal it is, or the more across the continental United States it is, the larger, and to an extent a little bit more obscure that idea has to be, the more localized. So I live in Millersville Borough, so if I'm looking at a candidate in Millersville Borough, the more local, because it is a local setting, their platform is going to be. It'll still be, you know, a version of the party line ideas, but specific to a very specific region. And then that's where you get different regional understandings and different regional concerns. You know, we've talked about this, or I've talked about this because you all aren't in these videos, just me. Being from Arizona originally, some of the concerns and the ideas that would have come up there. So Arizona is a border state. So border and border politics have always been a part of the conversation since I was little. People crossing the desert and what all that looks like. It's just been a topic of conversation for like my entire remembered life. But then again, forest fires and desert fires and the way that fire operates completely differently than it does here. You know, here, especially this particular summer, we're dealing with the smoke from fires from Canada again. And those wildfires and the environmental impacts of that are completely different than the way that like the California fires last summer were discussed, and the way that they were, you know, treated, and the way that people operated around that. The arguments underlying them and the cultural values that they roll up to are different because of where they are and where they're located. And that's what Conley is getting at with stasis. But that's also where stasis started with the Greeks, but the Romans picked it up and they really focused on it in a different way, because even more so than what we saw with Greek spread, we're seeing Rome spread across an even larger, and you know, we've got bodies of water, because we've got parts of the African continent involved. We're spreading into, you know, what we would consider today to be more like Asian countries. That just huge amount of groups that kind of roll up to this idea of we are all Roman. There has to be a connection somewhere. That's what the Greeks are finding. There has to be a connection for this whole thing to continue to work, and culture is a big way to do that. And so stasis theory becomes a way for everyday arguments to not just convey information and convey content, but for the content and the form, because again, we still have style, arrangement, and delivery. The content and the form can also enculturate. And that's really important, and that's really powerful. So pay attention to stasis in this whole section. And Conley talks about it for several pages in here because of that. This is not just about the way that rhetoric helps get ideas out there. This is the way that rhetoric, in getting ideas out there, also enculturates people in very specific ways. And that's something that the Romans are picking up on very specifically and modifying a bit from the Greek beginnings that it's borrowing from.